where mental health meets real life. I'm your host, Samantha Ariza, a licensed therapist, former educator, and a semi-normal human being, but really your go-to person for relatable conversations about healing, growth, and overall emotional wellness. Around here, we believe that mental health doesn't have to be stiff or scary. We keep it human, practical, and hey, let's have a little bit fun while we're at it, right? Because life is messy and we're all just trying to figure it out. Each week, you'll get honest insights, science backed tools, and stories that remind you you're not alone in this. Whether you're on your own healing journey, supporting someone else, there's something here for you. So take a breath, grab a cup of coffee, just get a little comfy, and let's dive in. Season 2 of the Ariza Inspire podcast is about mental health hot takes. And today we are tackling a spicy one. A hot take that I've seen everywhere and a hot take that I've heard a lot about, actually. Everyone has trauma. And as a trauma therapist, this one's a really interesting one to tackle and to really kind of get my hands on because it is a very nuanced, I feel like, subject. So, have you heard this one? I'm pretty sure you have. Because either TikTok or a casual conversation, you've heard someone say, oh, yeah, we all have trauma. As if this is like a universal thing like taxes, death, or losing your iPhone. But is it actually true? And does everyone having trauma really help us heal in the process? Or does it water down what trauma really means? So let's get to it. Let's unpack it. Because why do people say this? The idea that everyone has trauma comes from our broadened understanding of what the topic and what trauma really means. Because back in the day, trauma was mostly associated with what we now call big T trauma. Think of the basics of what we call trauma: war, natural disasters, kidnapping, violent assaults, those classic kind of PTSD type things. That is what we talked about as being trauma. But as research came out, and I'm talking about landmark studies like the Adverse Childhood Experience Study or the ACE study, this started showing a different story of what trauma really meant. It started showing how more common life experiences impact our mental health, but not only our mental health, our physical health as well. So, what did the ACE study look at and what did it find? What does it mean when we talk about adverse childhood experiences? Well, the researchers focused on 10 specific types of adversity that fell into the three big categories of abuse, neglect, and household challenges. For abuse, we talked about physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. For neglect, they looked at physical neglect, talk about food, shelter, medical care, as well as emotional neglect. Those feelings of being unloved, unsupported, all of those big emotional things. And when we talk about household challenges, they included stuff like growing up with someone who had a substance use problem, having a parent or caregiver who was dealing with mental illness or were really sick and needing a lot of help, seeing your mother or stepmother or any family member for that matter being treated violently, having someone go to prison, or even dealing with separation by your parents, parental separation, or divorce. Each yes added a point to your ACE score. And the higher the score, the greater risk you were at for all types of health and social problems down the line. This study was a landmark study because it found out this profound information that we hadn't heard of before. This study found that nearly 2/3 of participants reported at least one adverse childhood experience, and more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more. Count them, 3. And that's the thing. The more adverse experiences someone had as a kid, the higher their risk for things like heart disease, diabetes, depression, and even an early death. It wasn't just about emotional scars. Trauma literally got under the skin and shaped physical health. And newer research keeps expanding this lens. The DSM 5, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition, describes trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. But clinicians and researchers argue that chronic stressors like racism, poverty, or emotional invalidation can function in similar ways. So the reasoning goes, if trauma means events that overwhelm our ability to cope and leave lasting marks on our nervous system, and if so many of us have faced things that fit that, then yeah, maybe everyone has trauma. Or at least everyone has wounds. But let's look at the upsides of this perspective. What does this do for us to say that everyone has trauma? It kind of normalizes that hidden pain. When we say everyone has trauma, it can make people feel less alone. Like, hey, we've all struggled. We've all been there. You're not alone in this. And no one gets through life without some bruises. This is a major thing for most people because many people are ready to dismiss their own pain. I see this in sessions all the time where I have to validate and even normalize and even just tell my clients, hey, this was a thing. Because most of us do really minimize our pain and really say, well, everybody else has it worse, and don't give enough credit to ourselves. When we normalize these things, people can see that it is important and not something to brush under the rug. It helps us recognize unseen wounds because sometimes people dismiss their own pain because they didn't go through something dramatic. Smaller, chronic hurts can still shape us deeply. Yes, you may not have gotten kidnapped. Yes, you might not have been through a war, but those things that you experienced kind of added up at the end of the day. For example, studies like McLaughlin show that emotional abuse and neglect are just as strongly associated with the risk for depression and anxiety as physical abuse. And this was a huge global study. These aren't small effects. They're consistent, far reaching, and universal. That makes it crystal clear. If we want to tackle mental illness at the root, we have to address these early adverse experiences, especially emotional maltreatment. We need to encourage compassion, and normalizing this everyone has trauma encourages that compassion. If we see everyone as carrying invisible burdens, maybe we treat each other and ourselves with a little more gentleness. But there's a case against it too. When we start saying everyone has trauma, we risk watering down the term. Trauma is a clinical term at the end of the day for a reason. It describes events and responses that can lead to diagnosable conditions like PTSD or even complex PTSD. When we use it to describe, say, a bad breakup or a mean comment or online, or in regards to that story I said earlier, someone was just saying not so nice things. Like when we do that, it minimizes the intensity of people's experiences who faced severe trauma. Because when we talk about post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, we're talking about a very specific cluster of symptoms that go far beyond feeling shaken by a hard experience. PTSD often includes intrusive memories or flashbacks, where trauma feels like it's happening all over again. There's nightmares, there's intense emotional or physical reactions to reminders of the event. And people with PTSD also tend to avoid places, people, situations that trigger those memories for them. and they may feel constantly on edge, startling easily, struggling to sleep, or carrying a deep sense of fear, something we call hypervigilance. And complex PTSD, it's called C-PTSD, describes what can happen when trauma is prolonged or repeated over time, like ongoing abuse, neglect, or captivity. In addition to the classic PTSD symptoms, CPTSD often brings deep difficulties with self worth, problem regulating your own emotions, and struggles in relationships. Someone might feel persistent shame, emptiness, or believe that they're fundamentally damaged. They may swing between numbness and overwhelming emotion, or find it very hard to trust and connect with others. And these aren't just everyday stress responses, they're life altering conditions. And that's why it's important to recognize the difference between trauma as a clinical diagnosis and trauma as a shorthand for life's challenges. Both matter, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Another thing that comes along with this idea of saying everyone has trauma is the idea of making normal stress something more clinical. Because life is hard sometimes, and not every difficulty is trauma. In peer reviewed research like Bananos in 2004, this showed that many people are resilient after adversity. Yes, they experience distress, but they bounce back without long term impairment. In fact, his studies show that most common outcomes were people adapting and finding their way back to that normal life they were living much quicker than we tend to expect. Bonanno reported that anywhere from 35% to 65% of people who go through a major loss or traumatic event show this resilient pattern. And that means instead of breaking us, adversity often calls up hidden strengths and flexible coping skills we might not even know we had. And again, another downfall is this idea of blurring treatment needs. If we treat all distress as trauma, we might apply the wrong tools. Someone with a trauma disorder may need different interventions than someone navigating normal life stressors. Though trauma interventions might be beneficial for other types of stressors, they may not be the best tools for the job. And as a therapist, you want to use the most effective methods in helping your clients. Sometimes I do suggest like EMDR to clients who are dealing with certain aspects or certain struggles. However, at the end of the day, EMDR is super effective for trauma and it can be helpful in these other areas. But if I use it for everyone thinking that it's solving some traumatic problem, it's not doing the same things. So, what do we do with this? Here's my take. And let me know what you think about this too. Maybe it's more helpful to say everyone has pain, everyone has struggles, and that's what shapes us. Not everyone has trauma, but everyone deserves care for their wounds, big or small. And if you're wondering whether something you've been through counts as trauma, that's okay. The point isn't to win some kind of suffering contest. The point is, how is this experience affecting you now? What do you need to heal? And if the label of trauma helps you understand yourself and seek support, use it. And if it feels like it doesn't fit, that's okay too. So, again, what does the research suggest? Because, of course, we always want to ground this in data. Kessler et al. In 1995 found that about 60% of men and 50% of women in the US experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. But the thing is, not all of them develop PTSD. Bonanno et al. In 2011 emphasized that resilience, not chronic trauma, is the most common outcome after adversity. And of course, the ACE study again shows that while adverse experiences are common, their impact depends on factors like support systems, genetics, and community context. So, does everyone have trauma? Maybe not in the clinical sense. But everyone has something that shaped them. Everyone deserves compassion, support, and healing. I'd love to hear what you think. Do you feel like you carry trauma? And how does this idea affect how you see yourself and others? Never forget, you can always DM me on Instagram or on TikTok at Ariza Inspire Co. or leave a comment on today's post. Let's keep this conversation going. And that's it for today's episode. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you found something helpful, inspiring, or even just validating, I'd love if you'd follow the show, leave a review, or share this with someone who really needs it. Do you want more tools to support your mental health journey? Head over to arizainspire.com. There you'll find free resources, self-paced courses, and tools to help you heal, grow, and show up for yourself. These are things I created that I know and hope would be helpful along the way. But don't forget to follow along on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, if you still have one of those, at Ariza Inspire Co. That's where we keep the conversation going. We share mental health tips and post about new episodes and new resources. And not for nothing, I might be a little too honest and embarrassing on there. But I want you to take care of yourself, my friend. And I'll catch you next time.